The Hangout on air is live. Welcome, people. I'm now using my deep voice, and I'm now here with James, and we're about to get into the second part of the most terrifying book that Jordan Peterson has ever read. It's called Aion. Look, we both have the book now. We're so fucking organized.
It's such a beautiful book. I got my one signed by Stefan, and I signed his copy too.
Yes, that's it. We're rock stars to each other. That's how it works around here. Look at James's Christmas tree in the background as well.
It's very nice. I thought I'd set this up specifically for you people. I thought it might add to the ambience.
Dead right. We get that mystical feel. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to cover before we? So what we're going to do today, people, is we're actually going to, like, believe it or not, we're actually going to read the book this time instead of just tell you about how class the book is. So we're gonna break into it now. We're gonna look through Jung's actual words and talk about the fascinating topic of how he structures the mind. So this is very esoteric and difficult and abstract for people to understand. And I've worked a little bit now on developing a few metaphors that I think will help people quite a lot. But James, I'd love to know what your spin is on this, the value of knowing the structure of the mind.
Oh, the value on the structure of the mind. Well, first of all, the structure of the mind is essential to know if you want to know anything about modern psychology, because the structure of the mind was elucidated about 100 years ago. Now, also, you need to know the structure of the mind if you're going to fully understand this beautiful book, because of course this book is called Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, and the self is a part of the unconscious, and it's a part of the unconscious which is covered by other parts of the psyche. So what Jung likes to do is he's going to start at the top and work his way slowly down so that you fully understand the context with which the self lives.
This has sparked a thought in my mind that is, I think, is very important to clear up, is that the self is very strange wording for Jung to use, and it's very difficult for us to understand what he's really trying to say, because I guess we always imagine that we know who we are. You think about myself, or what I am, or my mind, or my thoughts, my personality. But Jung is trying to force in this first chapter, and he does a very convincing job of it, is saying that what you consider to be yourself, that is the thing that is experienced in the world, the thing that's walking around here right now. I have a sentence for this, is everything I see and touch is changing, but the eye within that watches stays the same. So there's this sort of like viewer, there's this observer of some sort, and it's like experiencing the world, and you think of that as you. It's something like weird in here somewhere. It's like you know, it's not at the back of your head, but it's definitely not at the front of your head, and it's like there, and it's like this consciousness. And you call that yourself, but Jung is trying to posit the idea that that's simply just your ego, and that ego is tiny in comparison to your entire personality, and the entirety of it is almost never discovered by you. It's yourself. It's like this deep hidden part of you. So it's a very interesting concept. It's scary somewhat. So shall we break into it? Yes,
I think we should. Who should begin reading first? Who do you think has the nicest voice?
That's a challenge. Do you want me to just go for it? I'll rip the plaster off.
Sure, go for it, man.
Carl Jung, Aion, Chapter 1.
Hang on. Are you sitting comfortably?
Please, strap yourselves in, ladies and gentlemen. Number 1, the ego. Investigation of the psychology of the unconscious confronted me with facts which required the formulation of new concepts. One of these concepts is the self. The entity so denoted is not meant to take the place of one that has always been known as the ego, but includes in it a subordinate concept. James, any thoughts on this so far?
Yeah, you said one of the words wrong.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you said includes in it a subordinate concept.
Oh, superordinate.
Superordinate.
I am dyslexic, people. Now we're going to laugh at this.
Yeah, so basically what Jung has done is he's gone back in time and actually he said the metaphor that you just said before you were able to say it. So the ego and the self are two different things. And he goes into it in a minute. I guess the ego is the center of consciousness, whereas the self, something else entirely.
I would love to ask you what you think of Freud's theory of the unconscious, because I think this is important to clear up for people before we get into this. Is Freud had that conception of the id beneath, which is like your animal instincts, your emotions, you know, those feelings that come up out of your body, you could describe. And then he said above us was that that super ego, he said, and the ego was like the conflicting regulating center. It's like the the stressed parent or something like that, trying to deal with the child, and then maybe the authorities of the society or something like that. I guess the best metaphor I could use for this is the idea of a king, and you have like the king in the middle, who's like the ruler and the happy guy, and like this is what everybody focuses on, and you kind of think that the king has all the power, but in reality what a king is actually doing is he's trying to keep the laity, he's trying to keep the people happy with all the desires like food and safety, and they want all this stuff, and it's not really like it's presented to him in a very kind of like craving, angry, emotional way, like the way Donald Trump's probably experienced in the conflict over there in America. It's just all these emotional desires and demands coming from people. And so the king is very stressed trying to sort that all that stuff out. Like whenever they shout loud enough, he sort of has to do that. He's not really free in the way that you think a king is. He's not like walking around being a badass. He's sort of like, oh, I have so much work to do. But then on top of that, you might have for example, an intelligentsia, a priestly class of some sort. These are the moral assertions of, say, the superego, so the priests, and they're deciding, all right, king, this is how you have to lead these people. He'd sort of be like, this id, these laity, these people, they're stupid. They just want to have simple, basic desires. We need to lead society. You need to make sacrifices. You need to do intelligent things. You need to disappoint them in certain aspects. And so you've got this other side above him, writing in their little academies and all this, and telling him and advising him, and it's like a massive point of tension. And what's interesting is that the king is sort of here at the forefront. This is your ego, and then you've got these two unconscious powers inside your mind. You've got that super ego, and they're both pulling on the, oh my god, that was James's id. It just shouted out.
And yeah, that was actually my id. It was like food, what food?
That was perfect synchronicity again. And so yeah, you have these two hidden forces in the mind. So yeah, this metaphor, you've got this king, you've got this superego, you've got this drives. This is like your emotions, your instincts is almost like the laity, and then your ego is like that thing that experiences life, and then your superego is like what Freud described as the rules that your parents put into you and your society put into you. So it's sort of the shall we say the mythic substructure of your society, which tells you how to be a good person and what's the right thing to do and whatnot. So yeah, I thought I better throw that out before we get into this, just to show what Jung, I think, is saying here, is that he was presented with this model, and then when he got into his really intense work with the psyche, with the Red Book and all that, he discovered that it's more complicated. So Freud had this kind of trifecta. He had like the ego, the superego, and the id. And this, and then Jung was saying that there's more, the scarier stuff. It's more complicated than we've made it out to be. And he's talking about something deeper called the self. James, what do you think, sir?
Oh, yeah. So Freud was basically a pioneer in psychology. And you've got to think about how ideas develop over time. So we'll take like genetics, for example, how we know what the stuff we're made of. Darwin, for example, he posited that, characteristics are inherited in some capacity. That's how we evolve. And then you move forward through time and you discover that, one of the molecules is probably protein, which does something with this. And then you move forward again. You're like, another one is nucleic acid. And then you go forward. You got Watson and Crick, who discover the structure of DNA. And now today we've got the Human Genome Program, where basically what I'm saying is you take a whole idea which is correct, and then you start zooming in piece by piece to try and piece it all together in as high resolution as possible. So what Freud's version of the unconscious was, it's correct, but it's just very low resolution.
Yes.
So if you take his idea of the superego, for example, which is the rules of your father that are imprinted into your brain, Jung wanted to try and change that into something way more complicated, and he called it the will of God. Like God, but in a psychic sense, like the will of God. This is how your psyche and how the structure back there works, and you feel like you're being pulled by the will of God. And then what he did is he elucidated everything else which exists up there. So Freud was correct, but Jung then basically took the microscope and zoomed in a bit further to see exactly what was going on.
Yeah, that is, and like again, we've talked about their conflict. Their conflict was Freud essentially positing that the creative, libidic life instinct, which was sort of personified by the id, was in conflict with the superego. And Jung said, I think that creative instinct might be more complicated than you think. And so they fell out. And yes. James, take us through the next part, if you will.
Oh. Are you sitting comfortably, ladies and gentlemen? We understand the ego as the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It forms, as it were, the center of the field of consciousness. And insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness. The relation of a psychic content to the ego forms the criterion of its consciousness, for no content can be conscious unless it is represented to a subject. What are your thoughts on that, my friend? This is turning like Bible reading, isn't it? So what do you think about this particular line? And the Lord thou spake, saying...
We could do that next if you want. We get into the Bible. I think that'd be great, crack. I'd love to go to Revelations. That'd be mad.
Yeah, we do.
This I think is he's further adding it. He's just elucidating and articulating his perspective on this problem, and that our idea of experience needs necessarily an ego, but he's sort of, I think he's trying to articulate that in order for the ego to experience anything, there has to be something that happens to it. And so in some sense you can have the outside world that stimulates the ego, but he also says that there's the inside world that stimulates the ego, and this is like a lot of what comes to the ego comes from the unconscious. So we have this ego, this presence, and we sort of think that this is the theater where everything happens, but he's saying there's actually a massive curtain, and behind that curtain is a whole host of underlings that are sending out characters onto the stage, and we're like super unaware of how that works, and that's a really difficult and complicated problem. And I think he's like, this is him sort of having a go at Freud. No, I'm framing that wrong. He's not doing that. This is just his theory. But Freud would have posited it as the instinct was like, the id was saying was the only thing sending out characters, and it was like, go get girls and go get money. And then the superego was like, no, go be a good man or something like that. And Jung saying that the director behind the scenes is way more sophisticated and sending out a way more interesting cast of characters than we understand. So your thoughts, James?
No, yeah, absolutely. What I read from that base is the ego is you. So as far as you're aware, it is you.
Simple way to put it.
And there are many things outside of your control that you don't consciously necessarily realize. And when you become consciously aware of it, then that's like your ego becoming aware of it, essentially.
Yes. Shall we move on?
Yes, indeed. I think we should move on, sir.
I'll take the next one. With this definition, do you ever hear Jung's accent? Jung's accent is fantastic. He lived in Liverpool for a while, I believe. So he has like a German accent combined with a Scouser accent. So he's like Wayne Rooney and Arnold Schwarzenegger mixed together. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it is.
I cannot do it, people, though. I'm sorry about that. That is a hard blend. With this definition, we have described and delimited the scope of the subject. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. I think that's really cool. And empirically, however, it always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which therefore is not related to the ego as the center of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects: those who are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those who are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown in the outer world, the second, the unknown in the inner world. We call this later territory the unconscious. I am dyslexic, by the way, people, so I will definitely screw up a load of pronunciation.
Oh, for God's sake, then why the hell am I not the main reader? Because I'm not dyslexic. I did pretty well in school, man.
I dropped that bomb too late, didn't I? Okay, what's your thoughts, James?
To me, just the simplest, I suppose, is basically the world is divided into two things as far as we're aware. You're familiar with Jordan Peterson being order and chaos. Well,
yes.
Jung is basically saying conscious and unconscious, but then unconscious isn't simply what's in your head as well. It's also the unknown. So it's also Peterson's form of chaos because it's unknown to us, the subject, basically.
Mm-hmm. That is and this is something where I'm actually going to ask you to bring up your story from childhood, where I think Jung's alluding to how the ego gets formed is the same way as like how a castle gets formed in the jungle, because in the jungle it's like this big unconscious blah of like danger and random animals running around and chimps and some men and some women, And then, so what happens is you kind of have to, you're confronting with all these dangers. You have to conglomerate a place of order, as Jordan says, a kingdom, a castle, a safety place. And so you consolidate this ego, we could say, or this city, and then you build a wall around it and you protect it. And it's this safe space to some sort. And I think what Jung is trying to say here is that when you are a kid and you go out and confront the world and you bash up against the world and it hurts you and you get scared and it damages you and all that stuff, you coagulate into something safe, which is smaller than the whole jungle, but is ordered enough for you to be safe in. And that causes a bit of a problem, because you've got the thing where you don't know what's going on outside in the jungle, but you're also safe inside this thing. And then this experience of consolidating an ego is very, very, very prominent in people's experience of life, but some people don't have it. But you said you had a very special one, so tell us about that.
Yeah, this is one of those stories which is interesting to people, because everyone I tell it to goes, oh man, I had that same experience too, which, although it's not in massive amounts of detail, that still adds something like, oh, maybe you're trained to actually recognize that type of story. But I was thinking about this because in one of Edinger's lectures, which we'll be recommending as part of this syllabus, it's where some of our course materials have been derived from, we'll say, he was talking about how Jung, when he was about 11 years old, had an experience of suddenly becoming aware of the world. Like in an instant, he suddenly became aware of things. That's the best way you can describe it, because we can't really turn the language of unconsciousness into words very easily, hence why it comes out in symbols, I suppose. But the same thing happened to me when I came off the school bus one day when I was 11, butterwee James walking around, and I go, mummy, I feel a bit weird. And she goes, oh, what's wrong, my young son? And probably she thought I was being bullied again, because it was absolutely horrific back in the day. But I was like, suddenly I feel really aware, mummy. I suddenly feel like the world has opened up to me. And she was like, what the hell are you talking about? But this was really, it doesn't sound like much, but this was really psychologically significant to me. And it was as if suddenly autopilot had disappeared, and I now had access to free will and choices. Like I could decide not to get on the school bus the next day. I could decide to go off and do whatever the hell I want. I was like, why am I doing homework? Or like, rather than automatically do homework, I'd have some resistance all of a sudden that would come up. And what I believe that is reflected in the idea of the ego suddenly consolidating itself and becoming aware. And if you're listening to that, maybe you can think to yourself, I had that experience too. It varies in age between like 4 and 18, I think, depending on when it comes out. It's no value judgment on you as a person or whether or not you're an NPC. It's just that experience of you, the center of consciousness, coming together and ready to move out into the world.
That's a really weird experience, because I was telling James that I can't remember having that, so maybe I am an NPC.
Maybe you are, man.
I'm hopelessly lost. Fuck you. So I could be hopelessly lost, and but it's very interesting, because it does sound like, for whatever reason that happened, like you're a kid and you're out there confronting the world, and then at some point, and I think this is a very important thing to elucidate, is that Jung says that we have a nature. I think I talked about this before. We have a set program. Our DNA has decided what's going to happen to us. We're going to grow in this kind of set of ways. We're going to go through these archetypal experiences. We're going to be a kid, and it's going to be divine, and you're going to have no cares in the world, and then you're going to get initiated into the world where you're going to have to be responsible. You're going to have to think for yourself. You're going to have to experience pain. You're going to have to experience fear and loneliness and not being dependent on your parents, and then you go into stuff like marriage and all that. And it seems like what you're describing here is a massive archetype that not everybody experiences, such as myself, the NPC. It's like it's this thing where you eventually develop the next level out of childhood. It's almost like that coming of age moment, where you're like, all right, I think for myself, which is weird. There's something really strange about that.
Well, yeah, that's why I'm not going to put like a value judgment on it, because it's basically elucidating to you, the subject, what your relationship with the unconscious is. And there are loads of really weird relationships you can have on the path to individuation. And this is a slight spoiler for the book. On the path to individuation, you're meant to integrate parts of the unconscious into your mind. But the relationship between yourself, so your ego, not the self, of course, because the self is a different thing, but the relationship between the ego and the unconscious can switch all the time. Like the ego sometimes wants to go nom and eat the unconscious, and the unconscious wants to go, no, you belong to me now. So you get into states of like hyper consciousness or hyper unconsciousness, which is that level of autopilot compared to like, how stressed and conscientious am I going to be? And my temperament, which is really industrious and really orderly, definitely reflects that one, where I have to like manually try and pull myself back into unconscious again, which makes sense about that ego experience where I'm further up than down within the myths. And it's not value. It's not one's better than the other. It's just what's the relationship between you and the unconscious is.
I think they're both like powers. I look at it like, magic powers. Like some people can be super conscious, and then that often needs to be in super rational, and then it can be, that's a very powerful thing to have. But like there's also people who are super unconscious. I'd actually consider myself somewhat that way. And you have a gift of intuition that other people just don't have, I've noticed, and you can flow with things in a weird way, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, you're way more relaxed than me, I've noticed, whereas I stress over smaller things like planning, and you're like, no, man, we'll just flow with it. But it's weird. It's not like a temperament thing, because some of it could simply be temperament and we're going off track. But some of it is definitely, you're more embedded in dream work and unconsciousness and myths, whereas I'm a scientist, man. So we are going to look at the world in different ways, and I'd be fascinated to see what that looks like for you.
Do you know what's really strange is that when I was growing up, my mom asked me what I wanted to be, and I said I wanted to be a scientist.
Oh, that didn't work very well for you, because you're into the flat Earth now, aren't you?
Yeah, we got into that, and that was my science career over.
God's sake.
And just on the last thing, like this is something I found very strange. He's like, theoretically, no limits could be set on the field of consciousness since it is capable of infinite expansion. So that is a crazy idea. He's saying that ego and that unconscious relationship, it's possible for that ego to grow so large that it could comprehend, it could experience all of the unconscious. Like, what would that be like? But he's saying theoretically, like in practicality, that doesn't work. But
well, could that be what happened to Jesus Christ, for example, hypothetically? If we sort of go into that, was that what it meant by complete transcendence, becoming one with God? Dying and rising from the dead properly. Is that what the stories are actually trying to say? I don't know.
Like that would make sense. It's like, because people talk about destroying your ego, but maybe destroying is the wrong word. Maybe it's more like you open it up enough that all the unconsciousness rushes in, and for some reason you sort it out, and then it like all you experience it, and then there's very little. There's no boundary. Like you are the unconscious. That's such a weird idea. So it's like you open the floodgates. It's like that city in that jungle. And then what you do is you just let the walls down, and then you just learn to talk to the animals, and then the animals come to try to eat you, and you're like, no, I love you. And the animal's like, I love you too. And then it's suddenly like just a great jungle to live in. So
you just dropped a spoiler for the new Fantastic Beasts film. That's all that thing is, him going up to animals and going, I love you, and them going, I love you too. So maybe this Fantastic Beasts film is something really archetypically significant.
They've been reading the Jung, I'd say. They're probably watching this right now, I'd say. James, do you want to go into the next part?
Yes, sir. Right, so up to 3, aren't we?
Yes.
The ego, as a specific content of consciousness, is not a simple or elementary factor, but a complex one which, as such, cannot be described exhaustively. Experience shows that it rests on 2 seemingly different bases, the somatic and the psychic. The somatic basis is inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which for their part are already of a psychic nature and are associated with the ego and are therefore conscious. They are produced by endosomatic stimuli, only some of which cross the threshold of consciousness. Actually, we should probably pause there and actually break down specifically what that means, because I'm a biologist and this falls right into my camp.
James, tell us what somatic and endosomatic means.
Basically, you can imagine it in terms of neurons. So if I go up and flick you in the eyeball,
what?
No, seriously, man. If I come up and I flick you in the eyeball,
yeah, you can flick me in the eyeball now. This is how this works. All right, flick me in the eyeball.
Or if I flick you somewhere else or on the elbow or whatever. Actually, not the elbow. That's the wrong example. If I flick you in the eyeball, it's going to really hurt you. Whereas if I flick you on the dead of the elbow when there are no active nerves, or the nerves are so down regulated that you don't really feel it, there's a difference in sort of your particular stimulus. So if I touch you, your body's going to detect it, but your consciousness isn't necessarily going to detect it. So your interaction, it's called the all or nothing principle in terms of how neurons fire. The stimulus has to be high enough for it to work. So basically, you're a part of the environment all the time. The air is hitting you all the time. Like the food is interacting with you inside, etc., etc. It's all interacting with your consciousness or your psyche, we'll say, but it has to hit a certain threshold before it becomes conscious to you.
That is fascinating. That is so. Endosomatic is experienced within. But is endosomatic. So somatic is the body.
So somatic means body, yeah.
Okay, and so is endosomatic meaning those things that don't cross the threshold, and then somatic are the things that do cross the threshold?
I don't think so. I think they're just two different terms for things touching you. I can't remember the specific, because endo means on the inside. You've got endothelial cells on the inside of something.
That's
So
fascinating.
yeah.
And so your body, your brain doesn't decide whether something crosses the threshold of consciousness unless it's valuable enough.
Yes, exactly. Otherwise, you would detect everything and you'd lose your damn mind. So when you go into a room and you start smelling things, eventually you like tune out to the smell. It's no longer conscious to you because it's too much information.
Is that what like, again, back to the Jesus and Buddha thing, is that what was going on then? Like, did they unwind the unconscious? And we'd imagine that it'd be like a load of mythic dreams, but is that what it'd really be like? Is like suddenly you'd feel everything in the room?
Well, that's what becoming one with the universe would be like. Yes.
And so that'd just be so unbelievably intense that, like, we think with our massive egos, we're like, we'd be able to handle that, but it's like, no, there's nothing more uncomfortable. I guess this is interesting. I don't know if anybody tried LSD in the room, but I've tried it before, and that is one thing that you've definitely noticed about it, is that your mind begins to scan, and your mind just begins to tune into things and apply meaning to them in such a strange way, but not in the sense that you're rationalizing. It's just that you notice things. And everything becomes, you can like feel it in different ways. Your senses start to crosswire, and so it does have that sort of sense that it's like you've broadened the bubble of that conscious, of that normal ego, and that can be very uncomfortable because suddenly you're like feeling the inside of your socks and stuff like that, and you're like, you don't know what's going on, and for some reason that's related to like God's feet, and you're like, why is everything so strange? Like, what's going on? So that's a very interesting idea about the expansion of consciousness, and I guess people sell this idea of being like, expand your mind, man, but the reality is that it's incredibly uncomfortable. Like, people say, oh, I'd love to feel more, but it's like feelings are disturbing in some sense. Like, they're it's quite intense to feel almost anything, bar like a few pleasurable exceptions. So it's an interesting idea, a fascinating idea.
Oh yes, sir.
James, please continue with your lovely British reading voice.
Oh, thank you, sir. I really appreciate that. I appreciate your nice compliment for me today. It really boosted my mood. A considerable proportion of these stimuli occur unconsciously, that is subliminally. The fact that they are subliminal does not necessarily mean that their status is merely physiological, any more than this would be true of a psychic content. Sometimes they are capable of crossing the threshold, that is, of becoming perceptions, which is exactly what I said, basically. But there is no doubt that a large proportion of these endosomatic stimuli are simply incapable of consciousness and are so elementary that there is no reason to assign them a psychic nature, unless, of course, one favors a philosophical view of life, that all life processes are psychic anyway. The chief objection to this hardly demonstrable hypothesis is that it enlarges the concept of the psyche beyond all bounds and interprets the life process in a way not absolutely warranted by the facts. Concepts that are too broad usually prove to be unsuitable instruments because they are too vague and nebulous. I have therefore suggested that the term psychic be used only where there is evidence of a will capable of modifying reflex or instinctual process. And then he references one of his papers too. What do you think of that, sir?
Now we're getting into the idea of free will and the psychic side of things. So this is interesting. This is where things become a bit suspicious and difficult. So first of all, we have the threshold here. We have the ego, then we have the threshold of consciousness. And as I said, that's like the curtain, and you've got like the stage, you've got like the curtain, and then you've got like the cast in the back that are doing all the makeup, and the director and all that. And he's saying that things cross that threshold of consciousness, but that can often be from the body. It can be like the actual experience of the world. But he's describing psychic as something different, to do with a will from within. So that's an interesting idea. It's like you have all the input coming from the world onto the ego, and then in some way, and that's the world telling you what's going on. So it's like all this stuff is happening to you, and you're like, okay, feedback. It's like you're getting, you're getting feedback, you're getting reviews, you're getting response. You're figuring out, all right, this is I'm octopus hands. This is what I'm made of. But then there's something in your psyche that has intention, that sends you stuff other ways. It might be that as we're describing, the instincts, like the desire to achieve something. So say you see a beautiful girl, it's like an instinct in you will tell you how to respond to that. It'll be like, go talk to her now, man. Or it'll be like, run as far as you can from that girl. That's so scary. She's so hot. It's like there is some type of instinct from within, and I guess he's calling that the mind, the thoughts, and this is where we're starting to build his new model. Is that the question is often, like, where does this free will come from? Where does this will, where does this desire, this intention come from? And many people would think, well, it's me, I make these choices. But Jung, I think, is positing that deep under that curtain there is this director, and he's down there and he's shouting to the cast, and then the cast are telling you what you should be feeling and thinking, and your intentions. So it's almost like there's a source that's hidden to you inside your own mind, and that's actually your true personality, and you only operate as this actor on a stage, as this sort of egoic personality. That's how I'd read that, James.
Oh yeah, no, that's absolutely spot on. Like, yeah, that was a really good metaphor. So when people used to be more unconscious in the past, technically speaking, they would say to you, like, this is the will of God. That's exactly what they mean. Because if the gods and the myths and the monsters ever live in the unconscious, that's exactly what it is. It's the will of this. When the Greeks thought they were like playthings of the gods, that's exactly what they meant. It's like there's other things in control of you. There's a puppet master. So your ego, exactly as you were saying, it serves masters and gods, and some of which could be quite sinister.
Oh, I can't wait till chapter 2 in the shadow. That's going to be awesome.
We've only got through 1.5 pages so far.
Yeah, man, this is going to be class. This is so much depth. That is, I'd love to deviate here for a second and hammer into the idea of the collective unconscious, because it is very important for this book. It's a very complicated idea, but like, it's hard to create a metaphor, but I think that's what they mean by the gods. It's almost like if the director in this theater, so you've got the actor, you've got the threshold, then you've got the director back here who's sending all the intentions. He's the one who wrote the script. It's almost like if he was part of a conglomerate of if he was like a representative of some really high society, like Hollywood or something like that, and so they were deciding what he says. And it's almost like it goes further back and bigger. And this comes out of your personality, which is just your individual one, and it connects you to this huge play that's going on all across your society. And I think that's sort of what they're talking about with the gods, is that, like, we are these tiny fragments of this huge thing that, like, it doesn't just stop at the self. It doesn't just stop at the director. It busts out his ass and goes all the way up into, like, the whole world as well, which is a fascinating thought. And this is very important for why he's talking about symbols like Christ and Aion, is because whatever symbols come through those Hollywood elites will say is determines quite a lot about how you experience life. Shall we move on, sir?
I think we should move on. Do you want to read this next bit?
Yes, with the dyslexia. Here we go.
Yeah, just don't mess up.
you asshole, man. The somatic basis of the ego consists, then, of conscious and unconscious factors. Dramatic reading of Jung. The same is true of the psychic basis. On the one hand, the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, and on the other, on the sum total of unconscious contents. These fall into 3 groups. First, temporarily subliminal contents that can be reproduced voluntarily, memory. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. James, I screwed up.
For God's sake, just keep going.
Third, contents that are not capable of becoming conscious at all. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous.
The spontaneous? People are going to listen to this. What do these guys know about Jung?
From the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. Group 3 is hypothetical. It is a logical inference from the facts underlying Group 2. It contains contents which have not yet erupted into consciousness or which never will. James, I'm going to have to ask you to tell me what all that means, because I was focusing so much on reading that I barely understood it.
Yeah, so we're talking about the ego, which sort of sits on top of unconsciousness, basically, and he's going into take a particular entity. It can fall into 3 particular groups, whether or not how conscious or unconscious or its potential to be made conscious is. So what's the order we went into? So basically, the first is memory. So you can basically think to yourself, what did I have for breakfast? Oh, look, my toast came into my mind. That's one particular group of things, which is unconscious, but you can call it into your consciousness. The second one...
There's like recall, yeah.
Yeah, basically. Second, unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily. Group 2 can be inferred from the spontaneous eruption of subliminal contents into consciousness. I would, this particular one, I don't know if this falls into dreams, for example, would probably be this, where they just spontaneously come forth, although you are unconscious in dreams, I suppose. There are particular states when random memories suddenly come to mind that aren't, so you might be somewhere and you might be feeling humiliated, and then your unconscious might suddenly throw images of yourself
Wow.
up to you, of you messing up somehow. That could definitely things into group 2. Group 2 is huge, man. And group 3 is the hypothetical one, and this is more of the collective unconscious stuff. Things which exist down deep below, which are a part of you, but which you are unaware of.
Oh wow. Oh wow, that is a crazy idea. Yeah. Like so I guess group 2, to get into it a bit. So he's talking about things that you don't choose. Which is, see, this is a massive problem, because this is positing to you that you've a storage base of memories and experiences, and you don't get to select. They influence you because almost all your memories like have affected you in some sense, and you don't get to select what happened. You don't get to select to bring them up or remember them. You're not conscious of them. It's such a weird idea. So they can get triggered. I guess that really plays into how your mind works. It's very associative. It's very, it's like a net, a web, like a spider web. And it's got all, like if you say, as you said, humiliation, that might cause this really irrational relationship to something that happened to you as a kid. And that's when it'll come up. And so it's not true like the rational deciding what happened to me as a child that screwed me up. It's the experience that really brings it up. So yeah, it's very fascinating.
If I go up and smell you, for example, and you smell like one of my ex-girlfriends, the images of me being intimate with my ex-girlfriend might come to mind.
That's interesting.
Could fall in there.
And this I've noticed that I smell certain smells, and then I smell the perfume that one of my exes used to wear, and I think about her, and it's so mad. It's such a strange experience.
You're not voluntarily thinking about your ex. It's just, oh look, something came up out of the unconscious. Where did that come from?
Yeah, that's very strange. And so Jung's saying that there's beneath that there's like a deeper architecture of what he called the world of symbols that operate that influence you in that same way. Like I guess when you see Christ and that image, there's something very mysterious and beautiful about it, and you have no understanding why, but it's because that architecture has been built up for like an eon of history.
Oh, there you go. Name drop the book, except it's Aion of history.
I'm dyslexic, man. Stop.
How the hell did you even read these books if you're dyslexic? That's a serious question. Do you just like stumble word after word and go, this will be significant one day, I'll promise?
I literally just guess. I'm just like, he's probably talking about something along these lines. And
also, you're highly qualified to do this lecture series.
This is just all assumptions. Like, shall we continue?
Let us continue. Do you want to continue?
Oh, okay, right. When I said that the ego rests on the total field of consciousness, I do not mean that it consists of this. Were that so, it would be indistinguishable from the field of consciousness as a whole. The ego is only the latter's point of reference, grounded on and limited by the somatic factor described above. Any thoughts, or should I keep going?
No, that sounds pretty clear. So the ego is separate from the rest of consciousness. It sits on it. So I guess it's like the tower that looks over the sea, I suppose.
That's interesting. Although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. It is even acquired, empirically speaking, during the individual's lifetime. It seems to arise in the first place from the collision between between the somatic factor and the environment. And once established as a subject, it goes on developing from further collisions with the outer world and inner.
See, that's exactly what I was talking about. It just occurs during somebody's lifetime. It develops over a long period of time. If you wish to know more about this, then go look up Eric Neumann's The Origins and History of Consciousness.
Yes, excellent. We will link that in the description, actually, because that is a fantastic book, and highly recommend it.
Yes, absolutely.
Shall we keep going?
I think we should keep going.
Despite the unlimited extent of its basis, the ego is never more and never less than consciousness as a whole. As a conscious factor, the ego could, theoretically at least, be described completely, but this would never amount to more than a picture of the conscious personality. All those features which are unknown or unconscious to the subject would be missing. A total picture would have to include these, but a total description of the personality is, even in theory, absolutely impossible. because the unconscious portion of it cannot be grasped cognitively. This unconscious portion, as experience has abundantly shown, is by no means unimportant. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in a person are often unconscious and can be perceived only by others, or have to be laboriously discovered with outside help.
Yeah, all he's saying there basically is you're made up of consciousness and unconsciousness. And now let's go and explore the unconsciousness.
I am just before we dig into the meaty part, I really want to bring up a point there about the very last line. On the contrary, the most decisive qualities in person are often unconscious and have to be laboriously discovered. This is a very interesting problem, because despite the fact that we're riffing on this intellectually, to put it into practice, to understand what Jung is trying to say, he's trying to say that you've got this ego and you've got this huge unconscious mind. And the idea is that if you can open up the curtain and look behind and see what's running you and understand it to an extent, you can actually improve the quality of the performance you put on the stage. We'll put it that way. And to do that, you would think, well, that's pretty straightforward. I'll just look into my unconscious. And then suddenly you hit a fucking wall. It's because, how do I look into the thing that I cannot see? That is such a difficult problem. And so often what we do is we outsource that to other people. We're like, well, tell me about myself. And that's the premier way of doing it. It's like, we will riff and you will kind of say stuff about me. And you'll notice that every time someone talks about you, you will pay the fuck attention to that. It doesn't matter what it is. If it's good or bad, it's just so important. They could, even if they compliment your shoes or something like that, it's just, you just treat that with such unimaginable value. And that's why people love that, is because there's something very, very important about knowing about yourself. It's almost like your psyche knows that it needs to collect this information, and this is its baseline primitive way of doing that. And
you have a very nice beard, Stefan, can I just say?
James, thank you very much. You have a very nice tree.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
It matches your shirt as well. It's good color choice.
It does, actually. Yes, I maybe that was my unconscious trying to understand this is a very synchronous, important event in human history. So
holy crap!
Itself well.
Your shirt and that tree does match quite a lot, man. Holy,
yeah, I know.
You're like a proper artist, dude, and your blue eyes as well. That's awesome. We're gonna get a bit flirty here, so let's move on.
There'll be a blossoming romance by the end of this thing. There's something I wanted to say about this as well. The fact that it's difficult to discover the contents of the unconscious is because, like, science is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful toolkit, but you can't elucidate the structure of the psyche and what it contains simply with science. You also have to have something which Jung called the feeling factor as well. There's like an actual, you have to investigate it through your psyche itself, which all of the rest of the objective world doesn't require doing. Hence why it's really difficult, and hence why people are in a hyper rational, I suppose. So there's nothing necessarily irrational about this age. People are really hostile to some of these ideas. They think, what the hell are you talking about? Shadow? There is no shadow. What the hell are you talking about? It's like, yeah, it is. You'll feel it, man.
Yeah, no, it's a very strange thing. Like, and Jung is like, really, I think, like, if I'm doing a dramatic reading, I think that's, he would have really emphasized this, is that it's laborious, it's hard. Like, so as I said, there's that one method where you get other people to do it, and that's very, very natural. And then I think then another method would be to go to a psychotherapist and sit down, and maybe even your family, they can do that, or a priest or something like that, or just a friend that you really care about. And it's like, tell me where I'm shit. And then they will just tell you all about yourself, and you'll be like, this is so useful, because they will tell you stuff you don't know. And that is such a strange feeling, because you can sort of, I've often had this experience where I have a really small sense about something about me that's important to know, but I don't really trust it because it's me. And it's very hard to trust yourself. You'll notice that there's a massive amount of distrust in your mind. You're like, you almost think that everything you think is delusional to an extent, and it's not. And combined with some type of hubris, it's a really strange thing. And then someone will affirm that pattern or trait that I have, and I will be like, yes, of course, thank you for saying it. Now I believe it's real because you affirmed it. And so there's that sense of there's a deep amount of work, and sometimes you need that feedback. And I will say one last thing is dream reading is that process that Jung talks about, where you allow that unconscious. The dreams is when the curtain opens, and then the cast show you their plans for maybe future scenes or something like that, and then all this stuff comes out, and it's really, really fascinating and weird. and then you get to look at it all, and then it goes back in when you wake up. And like Jung is proposing that if you take that dream reading thing serious, you can actually gain quite a lot of this unconscious value from it, which I've tried before, and I 100% believe it works. It's utterly amazing when you put it into practice.
Yeah, man, that's beautiful. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Thank you, sir. Shall I continue?
You can indeed. This is like a learning experience for you, and I'm glad to support you every step of the way.
Do you want to go? You've got the better English voice. Oh, the better. What? Shut up, man. You've got the nice English voice. You got the nice English voice.
I've got the sexier voice. What was that? Was that you said?
Yeah.
Clearly, then, the personality as a total phenomenon does not coincide with the ego, that is, with the conscious personality, but forms an entity that has to be distinguished from the ego. Naturally, the need to do this is incumbent only on a psychology that reckons with the facts of the unconscious. But for such a psychology, the distinction is of paramount importance. Even for jurisprudence, I don't even know what that word is, it should be of some...
Jewish prudence.
It's not...
I think it's, oh, who's dyslexic now?
Even for the prudence of the Jews, it should be of some importance whether certain...
I think it's jurisprudence. I think it's related to law. It's jurisprudence.
Okay. Well,
I'm so happy that happened.
There are long words. Like Jung's a smart man. He also starts speaking Latin at some points. It's like, okay.
Yeah. It's mad that he wrote this like in English. It's mad.
Yeah, he was a complete madman. It should be of some importance whether certain psychic facts are conscious or not. For instance, in judging the question of responsibility. I think he's just basically muddying the water and hyping you up between the relationship between conscious and unconsciousness, more or less. I don't think I can necessarily elucidate much more of that.
I keep going because I think this is where he starts talking about free will, so it all kind of falls in. So go for 9.
I have suggested calling the total personality, which, though present, cannot be fully known, the self. The ego is, by definition, subordinate to the self and is related to it, like a part to the whole. Inside the field of consciousness, it has, as we say, free will. But this I do not mean anything philosophical, only the well-known psychological fact of free choice, in quote marks, free choice, or rather the subjective feeling of freedom. But just as our free will clashes with necessity in the outside world, so also it finds its limits outside the field of consciousness in the subjective inner world, where it comes into conflict with the facts of the self. And just as circumstances or outside events happen to us and limit our freedom, so the self acts upon the ego like an objective occurrence which free will can do very little to alter. It is indeed well known that the ego not only can do nothing against the self, but is sometimes actually assimilated by unconscious components of the personality that are in the process of development and is greatly altered by them. That was a lot in there, man. Dropping bomb after bomb after bomb.
This is the thing about this book, is that like he was writing it for, it's a heavy hitter, so he was writing it for academics, and so every paragraph is packed with like, there's no chaff, it's all wheat. I hope that's the right metaphor. And I think the essential premise he's getting at is this little schema I've made of the drama, and then the cast behind them, or the director behind them, and the prominence of this unconscious desires, the libido, if you wish, deciding what the stage person experiences and does and thinks, and the intentions they feel, is so powerful that he's suggesting that perhaps even in law courts they should take it more seriously. You know, perhaps even in law courts they should sort of say to themselves, like, where is the boundary of responsibility? Like, how do you define that so strictly? That's a really crazy idea if you think about it. He's sort of suggesting that it's like, you know, it's not like everybody's completely guilty of their choices, which is like such a massive idea. And maybe people think that's a cool and interesting idea, but the problem is he's attacking the concept of free choice, of us being in control of our lives, because our egos have this sense that we decide where we go on the stage, but it's almost like, no, we sort of decide how we go on the stage, but the director is the one deciding where we go. So it's like we get to decide the nature of the dance, but the director says be on the left side of the stage at this time and all this stuff. It's this unconscious thing is really dictating to a massive extent. It's a massive puppet master. Your thoughts, sir?
Oh yeah, it's a nice way I like to think about this, which blows your mind, is there's no such thing as Stephen Fox. Like that's like a really low resolution term. We'll just say whatever you happen to be as such, that we'll call that Stefan Fox. But there are lots of different parts of you. It's like what's in control, right? And there's the ego, which has free choice, like you, or whatever, if you think it's an illusion or not, that's irrelevant. It's I can go choose what I want to do. There's like a cuddly toy there, which my fiance has. I'm going to go pick it up and give it a hug. It's like, I think that I might want to do that consciously. But there are other things behind the scenes that are pulling your strings, so to speak, where is it Stefan Fox in control, or is it Stefan Fox part A, semicolon, whatever, like another semi part of you? And in which case, what the hell are you? Like, are your emotions different parts of you? Are they different versions of you? Are you the same person you were in the past? Is there continuation across all of your psyche? Are the ego and the self the same thing? Well, they're not psychically, which means there must be different parts of you, and they both have an agency. They both have desires and wants and properties about them. So who the hell are you? I find that's a very interesting question in there.
That is a fascinating idea, because I guess like Stefan Fox is, since we're talking about him, is like Jung has another angle to this that he doesn't even talk about here, called the persona. So if you can imagine, when you go out to a party, like persona is literally the idea of a mask, and those little things that people you put on top of them, it's a mask. And when you go out to a party, you act in a certain way with people. You're like, maybe a little bit more charming and nicer and higher energy, and so you put on this character. Like, the way Conor McGregor, when he shows up at a fight, he's like, fucking, you'll do fucking nothing. Like, he's like real proper disagreeable and intense, and he's putting on this like rich guy angry character. But then if you look at any of his older videos, or any of his videos where he's at home in his gym hanging out with his wife or his team, he's like super down to earth, relaxed, and a nice guy, you know what I mean? And so you've got this like persona that you put on to confront the world, and that is in many sense your actual name. Like, that's just your name. That's your Stefan Fox. That's Conor McGregor. And then you've got your ego, which is so much more diffusive that it's pretty hard to simply name it. This is the sort of how people know you. And you often see this with people that, and they will form a Tyler Durden of some sort. They will form an alternate personality. And it's because it's so intense that they need to create that divide, because it feels like they're such a different person. There's that much attention in them. And Jung says that's a very smart way to deal with your shadow, by the way. He says that if you can artistically create an alternate personality and then master them and then reintegrate it, it can be very helpful for some people. And so you don't go insane, pretty much. And that makes the schema complicated, because you've got your social self, you got your ego, is how you are with your family, and then you've got the unconscious. And then all the way at the bottom of that is this hidden self, which is what you actually are. It's such a crazy. It's almost like you're starting small and you just open up the magnifying glass and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Sir.
Yeah, man. We've only got one page left on this. Should we finish the ego chapter today?
Yes. Let's go all the way to the end. How about that?
Let's go. I'll keep reading to the end until I find something I want to sort of riff on.
Sweet.
It is, in the nature of the case, impossible to give any general description of the ego except a formal one. Any other mode of observation would have to take account of the individuality which attaches to the ego as one of its main characteristics. Although the numerous elements composing this complex factor are in themselves everywhere the same, they are infinitely varied as regards to clarity, emotional coloring, and scope. The result of their combination, the ego, is therefore, so far as one can judge, individual and unique, and retains its identity up to a certain point. Its stability is relative, because far-reaching changes of personality can sometimes occur. Alterations of this kind need not always be pathological. They can also be developmental, and hence fall within the scope of the normal. So your ego is a malleable thing that may change with time, more or less, is what this thing's saying as well.
I actually have something I want to say on this, which is a very intense idea that Jung posits. And he says this in another book where you have this ego and it's quite centered. You kind of feel that it's you and you feel like you're in control and this is who you'll always be and it's quite stable. But then say you see a beautiful woman, as I said, you will get possessed by the anima, or the animating, the life force. The libido will just jump into your ego, take control of you, turn off all your thoughts, turn off all that shit, hit you with a really intense set of like desires and fears and emotions, and you'll just get a kick of feeling, and then it will say, make you act in the world. And it's almost like you're just here like da 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 da, and then you see the girl and it's like something grabs you and possesses you and takes you and makes you do something to its own will. It ignores what you, the ego, wanted or what you think or your rationalizations, and grabs you and flushes you full of emotions. And Jung described this as the way a stag can be, chilling out there eating some grass, and then it sees a mare, and then suddenly this happens to it. It just goes absolutely insane. Something like just fires up inside of it, and it's almost like a god reaches out of this hidden place and grabs onto the person and possesses them, and then sends them off into some mad direction. I guess the metaphor that people would often use for what a god is that you will notice that almost any animal can get angry. And so it's almost like this anger is this like abstract thing that lives in this magic space that none of us can see. And then when a certain pattern happens in reality, like say, James, I'm like, your shirt looks terrible. The ego, it was like Aries will fly out of the unconscious, grab James's ego, and then respond to that pattern. So it's almost like this pattern summons the god Aries out of nowhere. So every time you insult someone, you're summoning the god of sorts, and that would be the way they'd understand it. And that's such a fascinating way to think, because that implies that the ego has free will in the context where it's not in the presence of something that would trigger the unconscious to come out. And that is just the most craziest idea you can imagine. It's almost like you've got a CEO, and then you've got like the company of coders, and the CEO is like deciding what happens. But then say if someone comes in and like puts a gun to his head and holds his family for ransom, he says, you're going to do what I say. Now it's a way different scenario. So James.
No, yeah, man. I think we're making it sound really sinister, and we're hyping it up as well. But there's a reason why we are like this. We've evolved over a long period of time. So there's gods that come out of the collective unconscious. We've evolved to have those gods inside us, more or less. I'm saying God in like a psychic way, of course. The metaphysics is completely and utterly irrelevant, because what Jung considered real was psychically real, right? Because it's very difficult to sort of take the world of the unconscious and the objective world and try and have one systematized schema between them. We evolved to have them. It's like if you go out and you confront chaos and your ego doesn't know what the hell to do, it's like, well, of course Aries is going to come out and start killing people. So, well, not necessarily Aries coming out and killing people, but it could be other things coming in and being nice or being very romantic. Something else possesses you. So yeah, it's like it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's probably not always a bad thing either, but unless your shadow possesses you, because and which we'll get into next time, of course, because if your shadow comes up and you start revealing things that are hidden within there, then it can get you into we'll say a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and I guess this is really important for you to say, or for us to say, is that the reason why the shadow is often get you in trouble is because the things that you hide are often the most dangerous, sinister, and dark parts of yourself. So if you were a really evil guy, Jung says this is a really weird idea. If you were like super evil, super like if you were a serial killer or something, your shadow would likely be a very good man, which is such an insane thought. So your shadow would be like this Jesus-like character, and then you would do something like, say, be nice to a homeless person, or like, help an old lady across the road, and people would see that and be like, what the fuck went wrong with you? Like, there's something that's really weird. And you could say, oh, my shadow possessed me. I turned into a nice guy all of a sudden. It's a very strange idea. It's very strange.
Well, Christ and Antichrist are shadows to each other. They're both the self.
Oh my God. We just gave the book away. Alert. We just gave the book away. I think that's all right. Let's turn this off, man. That's the end of the series, pretty much. James, shall we continue?
Yes, we haven't got a huge amount left, so let's keep going. Since it is the point of reference for the field of consciousness, the ego is the subject of all successful attempts at adaptation so far, as these are achieved by the will. The ego, therefore, has a significant part to play in the psychic economy. Its position there is so important that there are good grounds for the prejudice that the ego is the center of the personality, and that the field of consciousness is the psychic per se. If we discount certain suggestive ideas in Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, and Schopenhauer, and the philosophical excursions of Karras and von Hartmann, it is only since the end of the 19th century that modern psychology, with its inductive methods, has discovered the foundations of consciousness and proved empirically the existence of a psyche outside consciousness. With this discovery, the position of the ego, till then absolute, became relativized. That is to say, though it retains its quality as the center of the field of consciousness, it is questionable whether it is the center of the personality. Dun, dun, dun. It is part of the personality, but not the whole of it. As I have said, it is simply impossible to estimate how large or how small its share is, how free or how dependent it is on the qualities of this extra conscious psyche. We can only say that its freedom is limited, and its dependence proved in ways that are often decisive. In my experience, my friends, one would do well not to underestimate its dependence on the unconscious.
Ooh.
Naturally, there is no need to say this to persons who already overestimate the latter's importance. Some criterion for the right measure is afforded by the psychic consequences of a wrong estimate, a point to which we shall return later on. Anything to say on that before we go into the final chapter?
I don't really have anything to say. I guess it is very straightforward in my mind, as he is pretty much driving home the idea that the ego is what we consider all that exists. We consider it this like premier force, and it's almost like we consider it to be the personality, and he's just enunciating yet again, it's like, no, it's not. It is not. There is a massive schema behind it that probably controls it to a massive extent, and it's so much more complicated and crazy than you'd imagine. And I guess it's setting us up for, we'll get to what it's setting us up for when we get to the last chapter here. So James, take it away.
Yeah, I'd like to say as well, he sounds slightly jaded, to be honest. Maybe we're just reading into this, but imagine like a really old, just recovered from sickness Jung. And obviously he's like a weird man. He has loads of crazy dreams. He's written the Red Book, for Christ's sake. Like the way he speaks, he's sort of hyping things up as if he has something to prove to other people. Is as if he's trying to say like, well, no, this is how things are. Like there is the ego and there is other stuff too, people. Stop ignoring it, which is very, very interesting to me. It's like, who the hell can blame him? Because academia likes to throw him away.
Yeah.
But
I think he went through a lot of stress because people wouldn't take him serious. Like towards the end of his life, he really got into the synchronicity, and he was working with a quantum physicist in order to try prove it. And he took his position as a scientist very serious. He didn't want to be discredited as a new age quack, even though that's what happened in the end. And so we worked with people a lot, but it was obviously like extremely horrible for him because he was coming off the back of Freudian materialism view of the psyche. Was like the craziest people were going to go, and then Jung was trying to say it's way more magical and complicated than that, and people were just like, no, they're super dismissive. So I think he has to be very assertive in what he's trying to say. And also remember, he was speaking to a group of students, so they probably had a load of misconceptions. And he was like, listen, you dumb fucks, like this is how this works.
Yeah, that's how he introduced his seminar to Zarathustra as well. He's like, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? This is going to be hard. They're like, yes, Mr. Jung, yes. He's like, all right, I fucking told you. And then it takes him like years to get the whole thing done. He never
no, hopefully that won't be like us. I'd love to do Zarathustra at some point. But keep going, man. Keep going.
Well, we got to finish chapter 1 first before we start talking about book 7. So we have seen that from the standpoint of the psychology of consciousness, the unconscious can be divided into 3 groups of contents. But from the standpoint of the psychology of the personality, a twofold division ensues. An extra-conscious psyche, whose contents are personal, and an extra-conscious psyche, whose contents are impersonal and collective. The first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality and could therefore just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, an omnipresent, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se. This is, of course, no more than a hypothesis, my good friends. But we are driven to it by the peculiar nature of the empirical material, not to mention the high probability that the general similarity of psychic processes in all individuals must be based on an equally general and impersonal principle that conforms to law, just as the instinct manifesting itself in the individual is only the partial manifestation of an instinctual substrate common to all men. Dun, 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 dun. That's that chapter over, man.
That is a cliffhanger right there. I would love to elucidate the meaning of this chapter and perhaps why Jung is probably going into it in such depth. Is again this schema I'm throwing up here on the board of this man acting, or this person acting, and on the stage, and you've got the curtain, you've got the unconscious, you've got the director. It's almost like what we see here on the screen. You've got the conscious personality, then you've got this sort of personal conscious personality. So this is maybe perhaps the actor's memories and the actor's experience of life and what they can consider uniquely their own, and perhaps their specific trainer that they had and all these type of things. But then further back, we move into the idea of the script and how that fits into the schema of all the things going on in Hollywood at the time. And like, you know, you make a movie, like you're going to have to use very specific symbols that are related to deep history. Like say you're making a historical movie and you're going to be Achilles, like Brad Pitt was in Troy. Like that's a really deep idea that goes far, far, far beyond even the personal unconscious. And even him deciding to be someone like Achilles on stage means that he's going to personify a character that was the hero, and it was like the super masculine warrior hero, and that character was so present throughout all cultures for so long that it is literally at God's status. It is such a massive symbol, and there's so much energy in that. Like you can even see, if you watch that film with Brad Pitt, you can see how he personifies this sort of swagger that you associate with that Conor McGregor Achilles type character of strength and dominance and just winning and that type of thing. And Jung is setting us up for the idea that what happens in this in this deep unconscious, we'll call it, in this collective unconscious, the way these symbols interact. He's almost suggesting that if you take out this personal stuff and look at what's going on in the collective, the way that the literature and history is trying to play with the imagination, and see that these ideas are actually interacting in a really strange way. There's a logic to them. Like if you say Christ and Antichrist, they're going to try combine somehow, or there's going to be conflict and all that. There's always this attempt to resolve tension, and just like there is this sense of an intelligence or an integrity to this imaginative superconscious world. That it's important to understand that, because these energies and symbols flow back into the individual, and they change the experience of the individual. And so Jung is suggesting that because this ego is so small in comparison to this massive collective unconscious, studying what happens in this collective unconscious can have a huge, huge effect on how we can predict how individuals are going to act. And that's a complete flip on the way that we think about the world. So James, tell me what you think.
Yep, that's absolutely correct, my friend. So basically what he's doing at the very end there is saying in your personality, there are two different types of unconsciousness. There are lots of ways you can look at it, but we'll split the unconscious in two. The personal unconscious there, and then you've got the collective unconscious too. And we know that the collective, well, the personal unconscious obviously is your unconscious, the stuff that happens in your lifetime, and you put it there unconsciously. Then you've got the collective, and the collective clearly exists because we've all got a basis on which we all act psychologically. And the same symbols and the same ideas and the same stories seem to manifest across all the different cultures, across time, and they come forth spontaneously, which is a very, very curious thing to do. And exactly as you were saying, the way you need to really elucidate who we really are is to dig as far deep into the collective unconscious. It's our deepest evolutionary roots. It's the part of us which evolved forward first out of all the elements of consciousness. And it's a very, very exciting thing to do. And how this links into the main book itself, as I said at the beginning, research into the phenomenology of the self. The self is, if you want to get in your car, your little Carl Jung car, your Carl-mobile. You start in consciousness and you go, we're going to go down into the center of the earth, and close to the center of the earth, which exists there and everywhere, is the self.
That's such a crazy idea. Oh my God. Yeah, like it is that is the self is the thing that sends forth the will and the intentions and the ideas to the ego. And so we have this conception the ego is in control, but it's really the self is directing it. And what's so mad is that what the self does is often dictated by what's going on in the collective. And so in order to understand that, you're pretty much putting up ideas like destiny back in the table, which is an insane thought in the modern world. We consider everybody to be free individuals who choose their own destiny. He's saying, look, my friends, it seems like that idea is extremely limited in when you start studying psychology properly, and you see the gods and destiny come back into tables with this, and it is a massive idea. And he says that if you can reach into that collective, you can, shall we say, make what's unconscious conscious, and what you thought was destiny can then become, shall we say, your ally or asset, or at least not your enemy. But in order to do that, we need to go into chapter 2, which is the shadow, and that is not straightforward. The shadow.
I'm looking forward to it, man. But I think that's all for today.
Oh, definitely. People, thank you very much for tuning in. This was James P. Dowling.
Hello,
fantastic people. Man. Please go to his channel. Check out that guy. He's awesome. Subscribe to him, and check the links down below. We're going to link the books we mentioned, And most importantly, drop comments. Tell us what you think. Tell us what you thought. Tell us if you enjoyed it. Tell us if you think you have a massive ego or a tiny ego, or if you're enlightened, or any of that stuff. That would be awesome to know. So thank you very much for watching, and we will see you later. Bye bye. Big love. James, any last words?
No, thank you, people. I appreciate you all. Thank you so much for your time today.
Bye bye. Bye bye.